All right, welcome to Thursday Night Live. Tonight we have the privilege of Dr. to be our very own Mark Phillips is going to present on a brief introduction to natural law. That's why we have the slides, so we can remember what we're sitting on. Anyway, enjoy, send questions, share this. The more people you share to, the more people will see it. All right? Questions, answers, comments? It's all you, brother.
Thank you. Well, it's good to be back. Sorry that I've been away for a while. I've been teaching down at the Bible College in South Point. I teach on Thursday nights, and we're on spring break, so could have sat at home, but I thought I'd come and hang out with you folks again, drink some coffee, and talk about a subject that Protestants don't talk a lot about. But it has some uses even in this day and age, and I'll tell you up front, some people think the subject is something of antiquity that doesn't need to be revisited. But let's take a look at it real quickly. All right. It's known as natural law, and prior to maybe the actually up through the late 60s, it's been more prevalent than it has now. It's been a basis for moral and ethical behavior and civil laws for a couple millennia now. And it's not limited to Christianity, so that's why we're going to cover it tonight. And to avoid some confusion, it's not the same thing as natural theology. Natural theology is the concept that a person can come to know that God exists merely by observing the natural order in the world. And natural law is not the same thing such as the physical laws that descriptive of nature, such as gravity. What we're talking about is a body of unchanging moral principles that are the basis for all human conduct. In other words, people do know right from wrong, and we're going to take a look at how this has been expressed over the centuries through both religious and non-religious writers. Some of them are philosophers. So a more philosophical definition, moral theory of jurisprudence based on morality and ethics, basically what is right. And it's very rooted in reason and common sense. Okay, this is a philosophical definition, discovered by man through use of reason, choosing between good and evil. And it does the view is that it is a prevailing universal standard across cultures. And I'll give you some examples from various cultures in the world. Like anyone that puts together slides for a class that stands at a podium, I have to have one of these word thingies, you know. All right, let's take a look at a number of proverbs. We're going to look at proverbs because proverbs from different cultures can express this idea of natural law. Probably the most common one we know of is the golden rule, do unto others, and you'll find people, non-Christians, finding that that's a good maxim to live by, to do unto others as you'd have them do unto you. But let's take a look at similar sentiments across different cultures, because you'll see something interesting about the geographic distribution. Okay, that's really what I want you to see. Beginning with an ancient Egyptian proverb, I've not brought misery upon my fellows, I've not made the beginning of every day laborious in sight of him who worked for me. Babylon, he who meditates oppression, his dwelling is overturned. In other words, bad things will happen to those who do bad things. That's like our idea of karma, right? He who is cruel and calumnious has the character of a cat. Right? Some of these are rather humorous. Okay? He whose heart is in the smallest degree set upon goodness will dislike no one. So as you see, we have quite a distribution geographically, but there's still more. You guys know this one, right? And ironically, if you know Genesis chapter 4, murder was still wrong before this was encoded into the law of Moses. Men were brought into existence for the sake of men, that they might do one another good. This is Cicero. We're going to look at him shortly. Cicero is a Roman, typically known as a Stoic. Some might argue otherwise, but he's the author of a number of things we call virtue ethics. In other words, you can't control anyone else's behavior, but you do have a burden upon yourself to do the best possible that you can. Okay, so it's a virtue type ethic. Right? This is kind of funny to hear from a Viking. Man is man's delight. We all know this one. Jesus' version is a bit more proactive than the others. But here we go to a complete other continent. Now we're down in the Aborigines of Australia. And this includes the idea of property, which is inherent in the idea of natural law, that you have a right to your own property. If the native made a find of any kind, such as a honey tree, and he marked it, it was thereafter safe for him as far as his own tribesmen were concerned, as long as he left it. So what's yours is yours, and everyone else has an obligation to recognize that it belongs to you, and you have a right to not have it stolen. So here we are on a disconnected continent with the indigenous peoples, and they have the same concept that you'll see, for example, another idea from Hinduism: the poor and the sick should be regarded as lords of the atmosphere. And another Stoic by the name of Seneca: praise and imitate that man to whom, while life is pleasing, death is not grievous. One should seek for others the happiness one desires for himself. Many of these are found in C.S. Lewis's book, Abolition of Man. If you buy Abolition of Man, it's dated to the 50s, when book publishers were deconstructing words and culture, and so it's a polemic against deconstructing words and culture. But the appendix is all wonderful stuff, and if you buy it, you can buy it for the appendix alone, because a good number of these proverbs are in the appendix. So, a Native American saying, "Do not wrong or hate your neighbor, for it is not he whom you wrong, but yourself." So here we have a people group entirely disconnected from the Aborigines and disconnected from the Chinese. Regard your neighbor's gain as your own gain, and your neighbor's loss as your own loss. Completely disconnected. All right, now here is a sentiment from one of the hadiths in Islam, and I have heard some arguments that natural law is not present in the Quran, but I do not know that, so I don't want to make a sweeping, broad, straight statement. None of you truly believes until he wishes for his brother what he wishes for himself. And my favorite African proverb: one going to take a pointed stick to pinch a baby bird should first try it on himself to feel how it hurts. So you have all these sentiments disconnected from around the world, from geographically challenged people groups, some of them very ancient, and yet they all carry the same sort of sentiment. You should know right from wrong. So you can have two views of it. You can have a secular view, and you can actually have a religious perspective. And we'll take a look at some philosophers and uses right up here into the 20th century. Okay. So you can have non-religious ideas of natural law. So this is starting to raise the question: where does this sense of right and wrong originate? Especially if it's present in all cultures in various forms. And if you notice some of the sentiments of the Buddhist silver rule compared to Jesus' golden rule, there was a movement in the late 1800s. Well, it wasn't a movement. It was really one author who raised the question of what Jesus did between those years where he's not mentioned in the Gospels. And this guy raised a question and wondered if Jesus traveled to India and studied Buddhism because of the similarity of the golden rule to the silver rule. So I'll let you guys dig that one up for yourself. It's not widely held today. Okay. Let's take a look here at our buddy Aristotle. We're not doing Plato or Neoplatonism tonight. Sorry, you guys have to. All right. So you know Aristotle lived about 300 and some years before the birth of Christ. So in his book, Rhetoric, he makes the following statement. He talks about laws, living by laws, and just and unjust actions. He says, "It will now be well to make a complete classification of just and unjust actions. We may begin by observing that they have been defined relative to two kinds of law, and by two kinds of law I mean particular law and universal law. Particular law is that which each community applies to its own members, right? As members of Ratio Christi, as a community, we have certain binding rules and a structure. As Marshall students, you have a code of conduct you have to work under, all right? As citizens of Huntington, or if you work in Huntington, you have to pay the user fee, just as income taxes to your respective states, and getting registrations on your cars. And nationally, we have laws. And then, of course, you have the United Nations thinking they can provide laws. So you have these communities to which we belong to. That has one set of laws, but Aristotle says, well, that's not all. Okay? Some of it's written and unwritten, right? We have mores as well in our society. Okay? We have certain phrases for people who behave in certain ways in our society, like, well, maybe not so much more, but in a time, a guy who went after a number of women was known as a playa, right? These are unwritten mores. If you have sociology, you'll study mores, right? They're typically unwritten codes of behavior that people break, but they're not encoded or ensconced in law anymore. But universal law is the law of nature, so there's some origin in the natural order to this law for Aristotle. For there really is, as everyone to some extent divines or reasons for themselves, a natural justice and injustice that is binding on all men, even on those who have no association or covenant with each other. Okay, so he's saying even disassociated people groups recognize these same things as right and wrong. And by the way, Aristotle got very close to the biblical idea of God in his reasoning. He's the one that came the closest, really, in some of his reasonings in simple natural revelation, not necessarily what the New Testament would teach, but it's a whole other side. So we move to the Romans now, and in between, there were, and I don't have time to discuss a lot of the schools of thought, but there were Stoics in Greek culture. Cicero took their ideas and moved them into a more Roman format, and he lived. He died about 40 years before Jesus was born. So he was influenced by the Greek, but he took their ideas, moved it into Roman culture. In book 3 of the Republic, section 33, he writes the following. True law is correct reason congruent with nature, spread among all persons, constant, everlasting. It's not holy to circumvent this law, nor is it permitted to modify any part of it, nor can it be entirely repealed. You can't make it go away. In fact, we cannot be released from this law by either the Senate or the people. You can't vote it out. No one can free you from this law. There's not going to be one law at Rome and another at Athens, one now, another later, but there's one law, everlasting and unchangeable, that will encompass all nations and for all time. Remember, this is a law that isn't written down, but that you can reason to. Then he says something very interesting, and he's most likely talking about, okay, now who is the supreme Roman god at the time? It wasn't Zeus. Who was his counterpart?
Jupiter.
Well, the emperor did think of himself as such, and he may have referred to that, for example. But so according to Cicero, there's going to be one God who will be the common teacher in general, so to speak, of all persons. All right. And this one God will be the author, umpire, and provider of this law. Now we're staying nebulous here, right? So here's a secular person who says that this law originates with this one God. And he doesn't go so far to identify it. And I'm not going to make quite that stretch based on his work, but we're going to look at Paul's work here in a minute. You're going to see interesting little connecting of the dots here. Furthermore, the person who will not obey it will flee from himself and defying human nature. He will suffer the greatest penalties by this very fact, even if he escapes other things that are thought to be punishments. You can't run from it. Right? All right, so we've looked at a couple of secular authors. He's got black eyes there. I don't know why.
Can I ask you a quick question?
Absolutely.
To interrupt you. The idea that Aristotle was using, or I guess Cicero in this case, was talking about God, did he necessarily have to mean like a disembodied mind or a person, or could he have been talking like there's an Eastern concept of God as well, in which you will be punished? You know, God is some kind of unification or law, but it's not a person. It's not a guy with a mind. It's just kind of the laws of the universe, and you still will be punished by, say, karma. So, is it necessarily that he was talking about like a Christian God, or did he mean God in a different sense? Because the term God is so nebulous that it can really mean just about anything.
I think in this case we can leave it nebulous.
Okay.
Yeah. I'm not that brave to make that connection, but since this is Ratio Christi, I do have to show a Christian perspective on the subject. So appreciate you guys' patience. Now, Paul, he was a Roman citizen who happened to be Jewish, right? And if you read certain texts in the Bible, you can see his influences from his studies prior to going to Jerusalem and studying the Pharisaic law. Now in Acts 17, when he's on the Areopagus or Mars Hill, as King James calls it, he's addressing Stoics, who are the mindset of Cicero and Zeno and some others in Greece. And he happens to quote a Greek poet, Aratus, and Aratus wrote a book called Phenomena about Zeus. And Aratus makes the claim that Zeus is the one of whom we are all his offspring. And Paul says, no, I'm talking about the unknown God, the ones you worship that you don't know. So he's making a connection using these ideas, and he's trying to communicate to non-Jews that they are obligated to an unwritten law that they know in their mind and heart. He uses very biblical language. He says, when Gentiles who do not have the law, in other words, the law of Moses, by nature do the things in the law, like don't steal, don't murder, these, though not having the law, are a law to themselves. So in other words, if you don't think it's right to have someone steal from you, and you go and steal, you break the same law you apply to others. All right? This is what it means to convict yourself. Who show the work of the law written in their hearts, their conscience bearing witness. So this is something a person knows, even if they never heard the law of Moses. And it is present in their minds that there is right and wrong, that they know they should be observed. And between themselves, their thoughts accusing or else excusing them. If you don't want stolen from and you steal, Paul says your mind will bring that forward, unless there's something wrong with your conscience. And then he puts the Christian spin on it, and don't take that the wrong way. I mean, here's how he's interpreting it. He says, in that day when God will judge the secrets of men by Jesus Christ according to the gospel, because when he's on Mars Hill, he points out that the God you don't know is the God who's responsible for all this, and he's signified that by raising Jesus from the dead. That's your sign, your flashing neon sign. And so you're all accountable to him now. And that's why they thought he was a vain babbler at the time. So you've got this very early ideas that there's something out there, and so we don't have time to cover the next 1,600 years. I do want to let you guys out at a decent time. But I do show Augustine, St. Augustine, and his view of the natural law is that was what Adam and Eve understood before the fall. That's his view. And Aquinas viewed natural law as something you could attain by simple reason or common sense. Okay. And so we're at about 400 AD, or CE, whatever one you want to use, an equal opportunity offender. And you got Aquinas, who's about 1200, mid 1150, right in there. All right, so we're past the time of Descartes. We come to this guy, John Locke, who happened to be a British philosopher who was a Christian. And he had been influenced by the whole Cartesian issue of mind and body. Okay, so he wrote in the late 1600s a book called, or 1680, a book called Two Treatises, or really two novellas, nonfiction, in which he wanted to discuss what it would be like to form a government that wasn't controlled by a king. In other words, a government of the people. So what would be the basis for forming a government by people that weren't governed by a king? What if you could just start anew, okay? So he appeals to this same idea going back to Aristotle. The state of nature has a law of nature to government which obliges everyone. And reason, which is that law, teaches all mankind, but who will consult it, that being all equal and independent, no one ought to harm another in his life, health, liberty, or possessions. This sound like a certain document you guys recognize? Okay.
Yeah, the Constitution.
Mm-hmm. Yes, because Mr. Locke, he went on to say that all men may be restrained from invading others' rights and from doing hurt to one another, and the law of nature be observed, which willeth the peace and preservation of all mankind. The execution of the law of nature is, in that state, put into every man's hands. Okay? So it's not the chosen few or the proletariat, right? It's every man has a right to grab hold of this law. Right? And also the consequences of justice, whereby everyone has a right to punish the transgressors of that law to such a degree as may hinder its violation. For in the state of perfect equality, where naturally there's no superiority or jurisdiction of one over another, what any may do in prosecution of that law, everyone must needs have a right to do. So here's that demand for justice to counteract this idea of rights of life and liberty and happiness, and the rights to your own property, and no one messes with your stuff or your inherent person. Okay. So 90 years later, we have a few dudes that you guys know, right? And they'd all read Locke. So here's the giant social experiment. The opportunity to create a brand new country with a system of government that had never been tried before in the history of the world. How would you build it? What would you use as the basis for this country? Well, you guys know the story. Okay. When in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve political bands, which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth a separate and equal station in which the laws of nature's God, entitle them. Now, are these theistic or deistic descriptions of God?
Deistic?
They are deistic descriptions. Okay? And I point that out because this whole entity of natural law is interpreted differently by different people. So Christians are going to assume it is Yahweh or Jehovah that has put it here. Right? So the struggle becomes, in a secular sense, where to find this originates. So in deism, it kind of gave them an out, because they could just say God did it, and that's the end of it. They don't have to worry about miracles or anything of that sort, especially if you know Jefferson and the way he thought. All right. But I want to point out something else. And you know this part. We hold these truths to be self-evident. It's obvious to everyone. You don't need special training or education. All men are created equal. Okay? But they're endowed by their Creator, again, more deistic language, with certain unalienable rights, among them life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. There's law leaking through, right? Now this is the part that's cool that people forget to these days. Because if we get tired of this government, we can just throw it out anytime we want. Right? Secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving just powers, consent of the governor. We're supposed to have consent in the way we're governed. that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it's the right of the people to alter or abolish it. You can throw the whole thing out. Some people want to keep it the same, some want to, right? I'm not advocating we throw it out. I'm just saying it's in there, right? I'm not an anarchist. But again, he's still putting a constraint. You need a foundation to lay it on with principles and organizing its powers to affect the safety for all, not a select few. And there's that pesky word again. So this is where Christianity rubs up against this document. Where are we guaranteed that we will have a life of happiness? Except in certain authors that sell a lot of books and make a lot of money, right? We aren't promised that. So this is where the American dream, the American document, clashes one place with our book. So, all right. So we move through from Jefferson. And it bothered Lincoln, this whole idea of all men created equal, because it seems to be brought up a lot these days. The idea that slavery was accepted, but today we look back and see that it was not acceptable. Right? It was an accepted practice, even by the framers. And so we have to be careful to make these distinctions, right? Because merely because it's accepted does not make something acceptable. And Christians would probably argue that point when it comes to abortion as well. Yes, sir?
I was reading something the other day that strengthens your point. There's a book by David Graeber, a London-based economist and anthropologist, called Debt, the First 5,000 Years. And in it he talks about the institution of slavery and how even at the time that it was commonplace, it wasn't accepted by the majority of people that took part in it. And especially the slave owners, they just did it because it was vogue to do. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, it seems like even then, whenever the prevailing wind of culture was pro-slavery, that if you asked individuals, you would hear something completely different.
We'll see that here in a moment, won't we? He's seen part of this before. I did a different version for one of his bioethics classes. So, all right. Dr. Cohn for let me come in one day as a natural. As a contrast to Peter Singer, I presented this information.
Pretty big contrast.
But this has been reworked though. I did it from a secular view, not so much a Christian view, because I was in a secular classroom. But I did put enough in that you could see there were both non-religious and religious perspectives. I mean, I covered the whole thing. What is. We can't change the past, right? I can really present the way this stuff is, and that's why it's still being hashed out. All right. Corn's here.
Cool. I was in the meeting.
It's all right. Come on in, brother. All right, now what really got Lincoln going on the use of natural law was the 1854 Kansas-Nebraska Act, because prior to that time, it was illegal to have slaves in the territory defined by the Missouri Compromise. And so this act repealed the Missouri Compromise and now made slavery permissible. So that irritated Lincoln prior to his presidency. He found it contradictory to the Declaration of Independence. So he reasons it like this. He says, if the slave is a man, is it not to that extent a total destruction of self-government to say that he too shall not govern himself? If the slave is a man, why then my ancient faith teaches me that all men are created equal, and that there can be no more moral right in connection with one man's making a slave of another. Okay. So prior to his presidency, this started to bother Lincoln, came up in the Lincoln-Douglas debates, and that's really where he leaned heavily on the idea of natural law, because Douglas took the attitude that it's nobody's business. If those states want to do that, that's their right. So he wasn't going to interfere. might be being a little overly simplistic, but we are making good time here. So I'm giving you guys the gist, right, of this idea of weaving through history. Here's some more of his words. This is strictly logical if there's no differences between slaves and other properties, but if you insist one is wrong and the other right, there's no use to institute a comparison between right and wrong. So the real issue was the eternal struggle between the two principles of right and wrong throughout the world. Okay. So his grasp for it was the catalyst for the Emancipation Proclamation, which was, by the way, an executive order. Okay. Just a little tidbit there. Yeah, what about presidents and those executive orders, right? And also the basis for the 14th Amendment that was passed after, his assassination. And I don't want to read a whole lot here, but the 14th Amendment in Section 1. Interestingly enough, just as a little aside, when Roe v. Wade, when the majority opinion was being written by Justice Blackmun, can you see in the first three words where he used the 14th Amendment in a rather irrational manner to write in favor of abortion? You only have to look past the first three words. So by Blackmun's use of the 14th Amendment, he stopped right here and took something completely out of context in order to apply it to his majority opinion. And so you'll find that most arguments against the way the case was handled, not so much the moral issues related to it, you'll find them hinging on this statement and how he used it. Okay? It's funny how this stuff all weaves together, isn't it? But then again, you see these same principles from John Locke: life, liberty, property. Right? All right, now we're moving into the 20th century. This guy was pretty cool. Robert Jackson. If you're not aware who he is, that's okay. He's not a name on everyone's lips. He was Attorney General of the United States, and then he became an Associate Justice. And he was also, I don't know if he was Inspector General. He was the only person to hold all three offices. But in any case, he was relieved or dismissed from his duties at the Supreme Court to go serve as Chief Counsel at Nuremberg. And prior to Nuremberg, he got together and drafted the London Charter, which contained three key phrases in their explanations: crimes against peace, which is an interesting thought; war crimes, which is an even more interesting thought, that in the middle of conflict, you can commit murder that isn't justified; and then the infamous phrase, which the UN is still chewing on 70 years later. Okay, this is still not defined properly, but it was defined well enough at Nuremberg to get convictions. Okay? So following World War II, you have this tribunal at Nuremberg, and so here's the issue. The nations were us, France, England, and Russia. And here's their opening statement. Now remember, 4 foreign nations are in the nation of Germany trying to convict for war crimes that are legal under the law of the nation in which they're doing the prosecuting. So they've got a bit of a problem here. It's legal, and these outsiders are coming in saying, no, it's not. So what basis do they have to go over their heads? What can they appeal to as some sort of moral compass that hangs over everyone's head? So he takes it to natural law. He says the privilege of opening first trial in history for crimes against peace in the world imposes a grave responsibility. The wrongs which we seek to condemn and punish have been so calculated, malignant, and devastating that civilization cannot tolerate their being ignored. Because it cannot survive their being repeated, the common sense, there's this idea again of reason and common sense. Common sense of mankind demands that law shall not stop with punishment of petty crimes by little people. Okay? He's saying, look, this is a whole country that's on trial. Okay? This is not individual acts. This is an attitude here. So,
We gotta do it.
I know.
I can put those slides online.
I can, yes.
Yeah, I'll post them later.
All right. You guys be good. Yeah. All right. So under German law, this extermination policy was legal. Fourth count of the indictment is based on crimes against humanity. Here's that phrase. Now there's even a game, right? Cards Against Humanity. It kind of trades on that title. Okay, chief among these are mass killings of countless human beings in cold blood. Does it take these men by surprise that murder is treated as a crime? Plain people with their earthly common sense revolted at such fictions and legalism so contrary to ethical principles, demanded checks on war immunities. It is true, of course, that we have no judicial precedent for the charter. This was uncharted waters here. You got countries trying to bring legal justice to a country where something is legal. Unless we're prepared to abandon every principle of growth for international law, if you hope to be able to do this someday later, which is showing up in some of the genocides that the UN's trying to work through. We cannot deny that our own day has the right to institute customs. Standards for war crimes and crimes against humanity are too familiar to be in contact. So, right. What exactly is a humanity? Okay. And I'm not meaning in the sense of some class that pads your schedule so you can get an A, hopefully. Right? And it's not a quantity. It's not like when you go to Edwards Stadium on a Saturday and see a sea of humanity, It's a term that describes value. Okay? And the idea is that inherent in each of us as a person is an inherent right that you have value for some reason, right? And I might say that this idea is now being floated as a human rights issue, and they're positioning according. Now, when Jake and I saw Jay Sekulow at the national conference last year, kind of caught me by surprise. Sekulow says that in the lower courts, abortion is being argued as a human rights issue using this type of reasoning. And the cases are starting to be won. So it's taken 40 years to position these ideas, that this idea of humanity extends inside the womb based on what the thing is, not its functionality of what it can do, not heartbeat, not pain, none of that stuff, simply what it is, that it has inherent rights. And that's how it's being argued now, and how it will be by the time John and I are long gone and you guys are our age. I'm not wishing. It just takes time. And laws have been reversed in this country. You don't have to look any farther than prohibition. Right? So people say, oh, you can't change an amendment. Oh, yes, you can. We just read that. We could throw the whole thing out if we want. Anyway. All right. Dr. King, the Baptist pastor. Now, we're going to discuss Luther's, not his theology, which tended more to the liberal spectrum. If you read his work, he writes a lot about regarding the popular theologians when he was in seminary, and a lot of them were European. Many of them came to the States, and many of them were liberal. We're talking more about his use of natural law in a Christian context. Okay? So he wrote a great letter called Letter from a Birmingham Jail. If you haven't read it, you owe it to yourself to read it. Can I get an amen from Jake on that? I had the members of his bioethics class read this letter. He lays out the case of how segregation is wrong, and he uses natural law. And he quotes Aristotle, and he quotes Paul, and he quotes Augustine, he quotes. It's just amazing. It's an amazing piece of work. So he's just sitting in a jail cell, cooling his heels, because he's been arrested for nothing really. So he writes this letter based in natural law from a Christian perspective. Okay, he says an unjust law is a code that a majority inflicts on a minority that's not binding on itself. Okay. This is difference made legal. On the other hand, a just law is a code that a majority compels a minority to follow and is willing to follow itself. This is sameness made legal. So if I had the letter here, I would ask you to read it in light of our current bathroom laws and see if the arguments apply or not. Okay. How does one determine when a law is just or unjust? A just law is a man-made law that squares with the moral law or the law of God. You will know a law is right if it squares with what something God would want. An unjust law is a code that is out of harmony with the moral law. So he says any law that uplifts human personality. Now he's not talking about how people perceive you as bubbly or sardonic or anything like that. He's talking about the human person, which we would call personhood, but he's using the word personality. Okay. He's using person as Peter Singer may think that pigs deserve personhood or chimpanzees deserve personhood. Okay, that's what he's suggesting when he's saying personality. Any law that uplifts human personality is just, and any law that degrades it is unjust. He makes a great point. We can never forget that everything Hitler did in Germany was legal, and everything the Hungarian freedom fighters did in Hungary was illegal. Okay. So I appreciate you guys hanging in there. We're on the downhill slope here. Okay, we're bringing it home. All right. You guys have been great. I know this is a lot of reading and heavy stuff, but this is about as basic as you can make an introduction to it. And instead of going into all the camps, I want you to see this thread that kind of runs through history. Right? It goes way back. Now, in case you haven't noticed, you may have realized that natural law thinking is kind of waned in this country. We don't tend to use it a lot nowadays. So I need to bring up something interesting here. This is just before you were born. What are you doing in 92, John?
92. I was an Air Force recruiter.
You were an Air Force recruiter in 92. Okay, I was working as I was working in marketing at a factory in Columbus. Right? Justice Thomas, the same thing we just went through with Neil Gorsuch, but this was much more contentious with Thomas. It actually was more contentious because they argued against his ideas much, much more than Gorsuch got. I mean, they just butchered Thomas, and there was a whole, well, I'm not going to get into the stuff that tried to derail the whole thing. But here's a good man, smart man, who actually holds to natural law theory. He's kind of a rare judge in these days that holds the natural law. I don't recall it ever coming up during Gorsuch's. He's a constitutionalist, but there's a difference between a constitutionalist and a natural law theory. Okay, and Thomas had written quite a bit before he got to his confirmation hearings, but he painted it more as the background of the Constitution. He kind of wanted to distance himself because he knew people would take issue with it. So a reporter for the New York Times described this whole circus that was going on in the confirmation hearings, right? Which, for the most part, Gorsuch's were rather tame, but it got into this crazy atmosphere. And Steinfeld kind of took the observers to task because they really don't know what natural law is or its application or its history or how it can be used in some Christian arguments we use today, as a matter of fact. He wrote, one of the more curious displays of cultural illiteracy has been the consternation created by Judge Clarence Thomas's expression of esteem for natural law. For some of the critics of the nominee to the Supreme Court, it was as though the man had let slip a reference to torture by thumbscrews. Others squinted as though Judge Thomas disclosed an obscure and probably sinister belief in alchemy. But this is the best thing of them all right here. This describes current state of affairs in Washington completely. There was a senator from Delaware sitting on the committee that we call the confirmation committee that asked the questions. And he made this comment after hearing Judge Thomas's views. Now Thomas was still confirmed, okay, and this was 91, 92. This was in Bush Sr. was in there. All right, so you've got a Republican president nominating a conservative judge. So the senator from Delaware made this comment. He said, natural law is a dangerous doctrine. Right and wrong is a dangerous doctrine. Any guesses to who it might be?
Biden.
Joe Biden.
Oh, goodness. That guy.
Because here's why, okay? Even though it's been around for millennia, it comes and goes. Protestants don't write about as much in the last 150 years. They used to write about it a lot. It's typically viewed as antiquated. The idea of right and wrong is antiquated. And it usually gets stripped of its why questions, its metaphysical implications, the idea that there are universal truths. I'm sorry the guys had to leave because I would like to hear their remarks about all this.
I wanted to hear you like turn apart a little bit upset.
All right, because remember we have a precedence now. Laws are now interpreted by precedents. Okay? They're constructed rather than discovered. They're based on previous laws. And so the ideas now are that human rights are culturally based. And I remember the high school group I was teaching, we discussed twice in the same year before the Supreme Court gave their decision. I told them exactly how the whole the Marriage Equality Act was going to go. Okay, I told them exactly, because here's why the problem happened. Christians were trying to argue this point as whether it is right or wrong. They were making a moral judgment. But the marriage equality decision was not based on its rightness or wrongness according to the court. It was based on gender discrimination. So conservatives are arguing right and wrong when the whole case is being argued on, can you legally discriminate on someone based on their gender? Now look at the precedent in Washington for gender stretching all the way back to Title IX. Is any judge in a more liberal courtroom setting going to argue against a construct discriminating on gender in this day and age? It's not going to happen. And so the issue was the way it went going about arguing. And it actually had, if you notice, I started way back and brought this thread forward. And this is true in these cases like this. It started essentially with health insurance back in the 70s when unmarried heterosexual couples were living together and they wanted the right to put their live-in partner on their health insurance. They didn't want to have to be married in order to have their partner covered. And so they argued that and they won. They said if you wish to do that and employers can make accommodations, you can have your live-in partner put on your health insurance. Well, fast forward about 20 years in the early 90s, it came up, well, what difference gender does it make what your live-in is for health insurance? Can you discriminate for health insurance based on someone's gender? What do you think the court's going to argue in the early 90s? You're not going to touch that with a 10-foot pole. Why would you discriminate for health insurance based on someone's gender? And that's how it was argued. Fast forward to marriage now, it gets argued on gender. It's not argued on rightness or wrongness. And so sometimes these cases, it's just the product of the way the system is. So here's the question, moral of the story. I said all that to say this. So without a concept, or without this idea of natural law, how do you think they would have obtained any convictions of no good? See, it's a little more powerful than people realize, and it's kind of fallen by the wayside. I was lucky to have a whole class in it at Luther Rice, and we studied it with regards to arguing abortion and bioethics issues, euthanasia, stuff like that. So, but it's coming back around. It will come back around. It comes in phases, and the arguments will be much better. So, I said all that to say this: natural law is the basis, from a Christian perspective, of being able to bring to bear desired outcomes in a legal setting in our culture. Because you can start arguing from a human rights perspective, even more, and give some teeth to the idea of rightness and wrongness. Because you're appealing to something greater than precedent. You see, there's some value in this. And have any of you guys really ever had a chance to study any of this before? Have you ever heard of it? Maybe a little bit? So, any questions, any thoughts? You guys need some caffeine or something to wake up? Yes, sir.
Okay, so my question is kind of specifically in a Christian context. So I would imagine that most of us would probably agree that when you look at the Levitical law, the law of Moses, that is not necessarily a reflection of God's moral law. Sure, it, like, you know, it reflects the moral law, but it also reflects specific civil laws for the Israelites. And also the prophets, Jesus and Paul, all seem to have their ideas of a law independent from the law of Moses. So my question is, what is the role of the Bible in helping us to ascertain what is right and what is wrong?
That's a big question. Well, let's back up a little bit and look at a couple things. First of all, you know, like I said before, when Cain slew Abel, he knew he was wrong. Okay? So there is this idea of right and wrong. Now, fast forward to Paul. What is his explanation for why the law of Moses was given? Because of transgressions. And that was because people were breaking this idea of natural law, and God finally said, look, here's some limits. Okay. If you're not bright enough to figure it out, I'm going to give you some limits. Right? Because all the things that we typically get attacked for as existing in the Bible, for example, let's pick slavery. Right? We have to make the distinction of whether it was an accepted practice, but is it acceptable? And the answer is no. And remember, the idea of slavery existed prior to the giving of the Mosaic law. Okay? And so if you read the Mosaic law with the idea that slavery existed, and the Mosaic law attempts to regulate some of the practices of slavery and clamp down on them, okay? Because it didn't just fall out of the sky for no reason to make people miserable. Right? It gave a rigid construct. And so the argument is, well, looking up to today, because even, you know, the book of Philemon talks about the interesting case of the slave that's now free, and how does the owner go about looking at that situation. So it's the idea that, you know, we're still working under the influence of Judeo-Christian values to rid the world of slavery, and it's going very slowly. Right? There has to be, and so we have to look at these ideas of accepted and acceptable. Okay, and you have to look at the cultural implications. So from the biblical documents, we can get a sense of right and wrong and accountability. The bigger accountability, obviously, Jesus really summed it all up in the two: love God and love each other. But the use of the Bible is the pointer to the fact, really, that all men are now accountable, which is what Paul says in Acts 17. Everybody's on the hook now. There's no getting around it. So it's not a tweetable answer to your question.
Oh, yeah, I'm sure.
Right. So there has to be a broad construct. Remember, the law was given because people were going crazy. God had to set some standards of behavior. That raises the whole issue of, the moral aspects of the law are still in effect. The ceremonial aren't. It's still wrong to murder somebody.
So essentially the Bible is, in the things that it guides us on, it's correct, but, it's not, apart from, love God and love your neighbor, it's not going to be necessarily all-encompassing. Some of it we have to work towards and figure out.
That is correct. That is correct. So you attempt to systematize or synthesize to the best you can. Will we be perfect every time? Probably not. We can't even agree on worship music these days.
So can I get a little bit more theological?
Well, yeah, you can always get theological. I may not die in that ditch with it, but you can.
There is an idea that I believe Francis Bacon had, that when Christ, when Christ provided this cosmic redemption to the entire world, that was what enabled men to finally be able to do science, or at least that's my understanding of it. So could you apply that idea? What would you think of applying that idea to morals? Like, Christ's cosmic redemption allowed us to more properly reason to, good morals.
I would hope that would be the case. That sounds almost straight out of Jeremiah and Ezekiel, that you'll get the new heart, and the laws will be written there. The laws of God will be written there, not the law of Moses.
I didn't think about that.
That's pretty quick, because I wasn't sure where to go with that.
I honestly think that's a more, in the context of the Bible application than what Francis Bacon had, though, when he talked about science and whatnot. But
yeah, I realize we went back, but just because something is old doesn't mean that it's necessarily false or necessarily untrue. They're not applicable. So.
Go back one step as far as slavery, because it's been argued in here.
Yeah, I know.
The slavery.
For those watching, that's a common topic of discussion.
That we have progressed.
Yes.
That's why we've learned,
Yes.
discovered that slavery is wrong. Slavery was wrong then,
Mm-hmm.
just as it's wrong today.
It was accepted, but it
It wasn't-
wasn't acceptable.
Exactly. We didn't progress and discover, this may be wrong. When it was wrong, it was just an acceptable standard.
That raises questions for current systems of ethics as well. If someone holds to utilitarianism, and 90% of the population deems that it's best for them, the 10% be enslaved, boom, you're right back there already. So, that if you follow ideas through logical conclusion, you can really be overwhelmed. So civilization kind of lurches along, doesn't it? You got a deep thought, Chris?
I'm thinking, but just
He's probably thinking he'd rather be with his woman right now.
what's kind of a good beginner's resource when starting into studying natural law?
A good beginner's resource, yes. I'll give you one that's just good right off the bat. It's called Retrieving the Moral Law. And the author's name is letter J, Darrell Charles. Retrieving the Natural Law, and he's got dual PhDs. And that was the textbook we used for my class, but it's very readable.
Who did you say the author was again?
J. Darrell Charles.
Now, will that, in that book, does it kind of give you some resources to go from there? Like, does it have kind of sprinkled
Yes.
throughout, like?
Another one, if you want to go the Frank Turek route, Frank Turek and Norm Geiser was legislating morality. Because they make a great point in there of an error I used to make. I used to think you could legislate morality until I realized that all the laws we have are someone's idea of morality. It just may not be yours and mine. So,
Well, I was just going to say some more the biblical idea that we become a law to ourselves. Essentially, a
Yeah.
Pauline idea.
yeah. Especially if you're a Gentile and you're never under the law of Moses, and then you start this high and mighty idea that I don't want to be stolen from, and then you swipe something. Well, you just condemned yourself logically. I mean, it's just logic, simple reason. I don't want you to steal from me. And you go swipe something. It's like, well, okay, let's be consistent here. So,
I've